Euan, let me ring my bell and officially welcome you to virtual Amsterdam. We've ridden all the way to be here with you, which wasn't very far because we didn't actually have to go anywhere. But I'm really glad that you joined the program. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, I appreciate the time and looking forward to talking to you.
Well, again, thanks for joining. So, here in virtual Amsterdam, we're really keen on looking at all kinds of different digital innovations. You have had kind of a parallel show running with Zeiss. Can you describe a little bit about that and what that is like to put that experience on?
Yeah, it's been, I have to say I've really enjoyed my time at Zeiss so far. It's been a year now, and originally I joined to help build the digital program, and it's been an exciting time. And sort of what attracted me, I have a strong background in digital products and medical devices, but most recently I've been working mostly on the digital side. And I think what attracted me was the kind of the data and digital opportunity here. I mean, we produce hundreds of millions of medical images in ophthalmology alone, and that's not meant to mention the sort of the microscope videos and records of surgical procedures. So that's a huge amount of data, and if we can harness that, then it's a massive opportunity to introduce new products focused on collected insights from that quantity of data, sort of insights around what drives good outcomes, less good outcomes, how to drive efficiency, help physicians optimize their practices, the usual things that you would expect from large pools of data. So that in itself is an amazing opportunity. And I'd say, Zeiss, in my experience, so even though I've worked in many different environments, it's kind of a unique environment in that it's a company that thinks very much in the long term and is interested in making those maybe longer term, but very high impact investments. Sometimes transformational investments. So that's as I started, and I started last September doing that. And then, maybe 6 months, 7 months or so in, there came the opportunity to also take over ophthalmology from Jim Mezzo's departure. And I mean, it's just an amazing business. I mean, I'd already been familiar with ophthalmology from my sort of digital experiences at Zeiss, not before that, but since. And it's just an incredible business. I mean, clearly it's fast growing. It's, we have 3 business units, each of them very strong. The surgical business unit, the refractive business unit, and the device business unit, each of them strong in its own way, each of them global, each of them growing. And with terrific technology, great people, very exciting customers, and just a very clinically interesting space, because clearly vision has such a huge impact on people's lives. Yeah. So that was too good to pass up. So it's also, I'd say, it's an opportunity to think about how you can a little bit merge both worlds, the digital world and the ophthalmology world, and if they're sort of how to particularly think about how those two can come together even more strongly. So we're exploring those things as well.
Well, if you think about the biggest, most impactful companies in the world right now, at least the ones that make the headlines, you'd hear about Google, Facebook, Amazon, these types of companies. And it seems to me that the thing that they all have in common is data. And, Zeiss traditionally, of course, would be maybe a more hardware-driven company related to the specialty lenses and whatnot. But I suppose now combining that as a data capture instrument, you can have reams of data and make sense of it in a way that's meaningful to patients. So that seems like that's a rather smart move, no?
Yeah, you summarized it really well. So, I mean, ultimately to me, I've been fascinated by data strategies for a long time. I started actually down that path, working in venture capital, running some startups, and all the startups I was focused on at the time were really kind of data strategies, data plays. Yeah. And I joined then Samsung for a short while and focused on sort of IoT for healthcare, which fundamentally again is, to me, it was interesting because it was the crossover of medical data and consumer data. If you look at lifestyle, for example, what can you learn about chronic disease and the impact of chronic disease and change the course? But ultimately, again, as you say, it's really about the data that you can gather from consumer technologies combined with the data that comes from medical devices. What additional things can you learn that can help patients? And then went to J&J, similar kind of technology there. But at Zeiss, you're quite right. It really is around, you've got devices here that generate data. The way you extract value from that data is really around insights. So you have to have the data, then the insight generation, and then you think about how to leverage the insights to help your customers. And I think that's really digging deep. That's really what we're about today, is figuring out that piece.
Well, when I think about the scientific world and maybe emotional involvement of what we do, I tend to think a little bit about peer review, and there must be clinicians out there that see data and are hoping for a certain result to prove their thesis, So I wonder if that kind of comes into play sometimes. It's not stocks, but it's still maybe ego-driven work, so to speak.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's ego. I mean, sometimes everything in the world is ego-driven, but I mean, people do start off with a belief, and that's one of the differences, I think, between where we are today with medicine and where we might be in the future with medicine. That most clinical studies are put in place because somebody wants to prove a hypothesis. So they had a hypothesis at the start. Whereas the difference between that and sort of a big data exercise is very often, or for the most part, you're not setting out to prove a hypothesis. You're looking for patterns inside existing data, usually without a hypothesis. So, and I think that does relate to healthcare very strongly, and where some of the opportunities are, because the clinical studies clearly have a role. They're the ultimate proof of whether a hypothesis works, and we need those in order to have the final validation that something does or doesn't work. But after that, if you think about after we initiate this treatment that I talked about, whatever that might be, with 90% positive outcomes, in order to figure out the rest of the 10%, we're saying that the reason we don't know exactly which 10% this treatment will work for is because we don't have enough data. But the evidence is strong enough in the clinical study to introduce this treatment, because 90% after all is pretty good. So post-market evidence after we start using that treatment is an opportunity then to figure out the rest of the 10% and maybe to see new insights about how we can make the treatment even better. So I think this is demonstrated today. I mean, there's definitely a much stronger move towards real-world evidence for things which are introduced to clinical practice. And the opportunity then is to really make that real-world evidence gathering a much larger patient sample that was in the initial clinical study, but also to gather a much larger sort of set of data about all patients as a treatment is introduced. And that second part isn't always the case. The second part can often be, it can often be ignored, and sort of real-world evidence is a kind of extension of the clinical study. But to me, I think certainly in many cases, there's an opportunity to make that a chance to collect a much broader data set and really learn more than we learn from the clinical study about sort of what makes a treatment work or not.
And then two last product points here. Angela Rego mentioned ask about cloud extension to Forum during EURETINA and ESCRS. That's all I saw on LinkedIn, but tell me more about that.
Well, I think this is a high priority product in this day and age. We recognize that work for healthcare as well as every other industry, but work in medicine to a large extent is taking place in different locations. We talked already about the need for sharing data. That really drives efficiency. So to enable physicians to have the flexibility to access data that they've recorded in clinic from a different location, and to offer them the means of sharing that data with other physicians, whether it's a second opinion or for a referral, those things are really important, and probably even more important now than they were kind of pre-COVID. And that's really what this sort of forum development enables. It's a way of sharing data and accessing data that was collected inside a clinic, reviewing it and sharing it outside the clinic through use of the cloud. So I think it is an important development.
And the OPT workflow approach, maybe specifically related to the Zeiss corneal refractive workflow, what do these fancy phrases mean?
This again is really important for us. So our reaction to a company, I think, as a company was phenomenal. When things did go into almost complete shutdown, we spent tens of thousands of hours talking to customers, and we had different types of conversation, but lots of them were focused on, what can we do for you now?
Yeah.
We engaged in digital education programs and outreach, connectivity between us and them, sort of customers and each other. And the other conversations were about what do you think is going to happen next? When we start to reopen, what do you think the challenges will be? And we also studied as certain markets reopened, such as some of the Asian markets, China started to reopen earlier than perhaps Europe and the US. We looked at what was happening with those in those clinics and figuring out what restrictions are they under, as in what people are calling the new normal, what restrictions happened. And we put together a whole program then of relatively, I'd say in some cases, small things, sharing best practices, learnings from clinics as they opened. We put together some technology programs. We donated about 100,000 breast shields, which were just simple ways of protecting staff and patients from one another, protecting from cross-contamination. And we put together a website called MedSupport Now, which was really just focused on giving information, clinics and technology, data and information and technologies to help them restart. And that really has transitioned. We built on that. We recognize most clinics are now up and running and many of those things are in place, but there's still an incredible need to focus on workflow, because workflow is the thing that hasn't really recovered yet 100%. So our positioning about all of our technologies across the board at ESCRS has really been around demonstrating the value from a workflow perspective of those technologies. And even when we've had new product launches, which we've demonstrated at ESCRS, they've been in the context of what we can do to help physicians with their workflow. Now, we don't think that will ever stop. We think this focus on workflow, even in steady state, it's a very valuable sort of solution-based strategy. So I don't see that necessarily changing for us. But that's really, I'd say, the evolution has its roots in what happened during the pandemic.
Well, that's the alarm, Euan. So I've got my own alarm here. Thanks so much for joining us today. We really enjoyed our little bike ride together in Amsterdam with you. You're welcome to come back anytime. We might actually have a motorcycle in the future, so please join us again.
I will do that, Matt. I really appreciate it. I look forward to the next one being in person.